Hello, students. All right, we are going to finish Unit 8, 8.6 to 8.9, although really, 8.9 is just the summary. So let's go over it. I've got a lot of kind of bits and pieces I'm going to throw at you. So I know you'll be taking pauses to kind of go through this because it's not all included on the slides. So let's start right at 8.6. All right, we've got some newly independent states. We're especially going to talk about Israel, and Israel is, whew, it's a doozy. All right. We know that when we start decolonizing, all these places are going to start to redraw their lines. So let's kind of go into Zionism, and we really got to start about 1917. We remember the mandate system. Remember that was when we were pieces of land were given after World War I to different countries, and especially if the Ottoman Empire broke apart after World War I. This piece of land, Palestine area, was given to the British. So the Balfour Declaration was a public statement issued by the British government in 1917 during the First World War, announcing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The statement came in the form of a letter from Britain's then Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, hence the name, addressed to Lionel Walter Rothschild, who was essentially a figurehead of the British Jewish community. The case of Palestine, however, was unique. Unlike the rest of the post-war mandates, the main goal of the British mandate was that there was to create the conditions for the establishment of a Jewish national home, where Jews constituted less than 10% of the population at the time. Upon the start of this mandate, the British began to facilitate the immigration of European Jews to Palestine. Between 1922 and 1935, the Jewish population rose from 9% to nearly 20% of the total population. I know a lot of people think that this portion of land was created for Jews to go to after World War II, but you have to understand that after World War II, when Jews went to this part of the world, many Jews that were already living there were looking at them going, "You're European Jews, you're not Middle Eastern Jews, you're very different." So, because many of the Jews that were living there since 1922 to 1935 had already established themselves as Middle Eastern Jews. So there was a little bit of blowback to many Jews who went there, of course, who had nowhere to go. So let's go back in time to when this mandate got set up. So this mandate was set up in a way to equip Jews with the tools to eventually establish self-rule at the expense of the Palestinian Arabs. So I'm going to tell you, this is going to get complicated, and we want to talk about this because this is an issue that is affecting this area to this day. The document is controversial for several reasons. First, it was, in the words of the late Palestinian American academic Edward Said, yes, his last name was Said, made by a European power about a non-European territory in a flat disregard of both the presence and wishes of the native majority resident in that territory. In essence, the Balfour Declaration promised Jews a land where the natives made up more than 90% of the population. Secondly, Britain had already promised the Arabs independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 1915 Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. I might be saying that incorrectly, and I apologize, but essentially they already told Arabs, you're going to get independence several years earlier. So the British also promised the French in a separate treaty known as the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement that the majority of Palestine would be under international administration, while the rest of the region would be split between the two colonial powers after the war. So essentially, the British told three different groups of people three different things, which, you know me, that makes sense. All right. The declaration, however, meant that Palestine would come under British occupation and that the Palestinian Arabs who lived there would not gain independence. Finally, the declaration introduced a notion that was reportedly unprecedented in international law, that of a, quote, national home. The use of the vague term national home for the Jewish people, as opposed to the term state, left the meaning open to interpretation. In a meeting with Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann in 1922, however, author Balfour and then Prime Minister David Lloyd George reportedly said that the Balfour Declaration always meant an eventual Jewish state. In mainstream academia, however, there are a set of reasons over which there is a general consensus. Control over Palestine was a strategic imperial interest to keep Egypt and the Suez Canal within British sphere of influence. Britain had to side with the Zionists to rally support among Jews in the United States and Russia, hoping they would encourage their governments to stay in the war until victory. Remember, the war was the Great War, World War I. Intense Zionist lobbying and strong connections between the Zionist community in Britain and the British government. Some of the officials in the government were Zionists themselves. Zionists, of course, are those that believe that there is a holy land set up and that Jews should be there. The Holy Land, of course, is around Jerusalem. And lastly, that Jews were being persecuted in Europe and the British government was sympathetic to their suffering. So what impact does this have on the Palestinians? Those are the people that are already living there. The Balfour Declaration is widely seen as a precursor to the 1948 Palestinian Nakba, when Zionist armed groups who were trained by the British forcibly expelled more than 750,000 Palestinians from their homeland. All right, so let's go on to what's going to happen. Remember, we're all about causes and effects. So you're leading up to these 30 years of conflict ensue between the Israel and Arab neighbors. They are forced to live together. So you got this group called the PLO. PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat. It is an umbrella political organization claiming to represent the world's Palestinians. These Arabs and their descendants, they live in a mandated Palestine before the creation there of the State of Israel in 1948. It was formed in 1964 to centralize the leadership of various Palestinian groups that previously had operated as clandestine resistance movements. It came into prominence only after the Six-Day War of June 1967, however, and engaged in a protracted guerrilla war against Israel during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s before entering into peace negotiations with that country in the 1990s. So let me tell you about the Six-Day War. And when you hear it, I need you to kind of step out of whatever side you pick, and maybe you'll kind of understand the issue. Six-Day War was June 5th to June 10th of 1967. This is the third of the Arab-Israeli wars. Israel took the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. So they went to war with several different countries: Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Egypt lost 11,000 people. Syria lost 1,000, and Jordan lost 6,000. Only 700 people died for Israel. I mean, Israel, they have a military that you don't want to mess with. But the United Nations called for Israel to withdraw their people from the territories it had captured in exchange for lasting peace, and essentially were pushing for what is known as a two-state solution, essentially saying we need to have a Palestine and we need to have an Israel. We should have a two-state solution. So the PLO basically is a group of Arabs who started as nonviolent, and they were violent, and they were nonviolent again in the 90s, and then they were violent again during 2000, 2005. And then it gets a little sticky. A Sunni Islamic militant group known as Hamas won the majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council elections, and then there was more violence. Hamas is on the U.S. State Department's list of terrorist organizations and has been since 1997. So Hamas currently controls Gaza, and another group known as Fatah controls the West Bank, and they are currently trying to work together. The PLO today is seen as a non-member observer state of the UN General Assembly, and they have been since 2012. And they did become a member of the International Criminal Court, which is a part of the UN, in 2015. They are essentially trying to stop violence and be seen as a voting member of the UN, and they want Palestinian statehood. But both Israel and the US oppose that. So it's a sticky situation because many countries think that Palestine should become a state, and the US and Israel don't. So it's a complicated, sticky situation that I do encourage you to learn more about, because at some point in your life, someone's going to ask you the question, what do you think? All right. So Israel's not the only state that's going to form during this time. We have Pakistan, we have Cambodia. They're both going to become independent. Africa is becoming decolonized. Pakistan's going to become independent, obviously, from England, and of course, India. It splits off. And Cambodia is going to become independent from France. As these new states form, populations were displaced or resettled. And now, migrations are going to occur. So, formal colonial subjects are even going to migrate back to their imperial metropolises. Migrants are even going to go to major cities. So, you have Algerians going over to France. You have South Asians going over to England. That's why there are many Indians and Pakistanis who live in London. You have Filipinos moving to the United States. What is the result? Obviously, cultural and economic ties between the colony and the metropole are maintained despite decolonization. There are still ties between these countries. So, the governments of these new states will often take a very active role in guiding economic life to promote development. All right, so who are these people on here? This gentleman on this side, his name is Gamal Abdel Nasser. He works in Egypt. We have Indira Gandhi. This is from India. We have Julius Nyerere from Tanzania. And this one, I worked really hard, Sirimavo Bandaranaike from Sri Lanka. Let me tell you a little bit about that. All right, we have Indira Gandhi here, takes power in 1966, fought Pakistan and wins with help from the USSR during the Cold War, comes up with a 20-point economic program to alleviate inflation, reform corrupt laws, and of course, increase production. Unfortunately, some of the policies were unpopular and loses in the 1977 election, but returns to become prime minister in 1980, but unfortunately was assassinated 4 years later. Then we have the world's first female prime minister, Sirimavo Bandaranaike. Socialist for Sri Lanka. There was a sagging economy which led to her defeat, unfortunately, in 1965, but she returns to power 5 years later with some radical policies, with land reform, restricting free enterprise, and renamed Ceylon to Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, was voted out in 1977, but remained involved in politics. So the reason I wanted to point out these people, not only because they're women, and we have a rise in feminist policies. We're going to talk about this in Unit 9, how women essentially are getting the power to vote, the power to run in politics in many of these countries. But when they took over these countries, it was, we've got to get economics off the ground. And that's a big deal. We've been hearing a lot about it in the news, but that's something that you always want to hear. If someone comes to power, they're going to try to revive the economics. And that's because how do we vote? We vote with our pocketbooks. So that's a big deal. So that's why sagging economy for her, and she comes and Indira Gandhi came up with a 20-point economic program, especially because they're coming out of colonization. So now they've got to stand on their own 2 feet and they have to prove that our country can do this. All right, and then here we've got Julius Nyerere for Tanzania. It became independent in 1961. He is the first president. He came up with the cooperative agricultural idea. Obviously, it's a socialist idea. He pushes literacy campaigns and free education. He was very popular. Unfortunately, the country did remain poor, and he resigned in 1985. Now, we're going to have global resistance to establish power structures. So I know I have Martin Luther King on here. Obviously, I love Martin Luther King, but I love him for the reason that he modeled his civil rights activism after the nonviolent precedent of Mohandas Gandhi. Now, the reason he knew about the nonviolent precedent was he had a friend named Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin's been getting his due, thankfully, in most recent years. Bayard Rustin was a friend of his. He went down to India to learn about the nonviolent movement. And he basically came back to Martin Luther King Jr. and he goes to his house. And Martin Luther King Jr. had a lot of guards and he had guns in his house. And he said, look, we can't preach, these ideas. We can't meet with violence. and have the cops come at us with violence. We can't say we're better than them because if I saw what Gandhi did. Of course, he didn't actually see it. He met with the people who knew Gandhi because Gandhi was gone by then. But he said, I learned what they did, and what he did was revolutionary. He went with nonviolence. So if we go with nonviolence and we sit at restaurants and they can put the dogs on us and they can put the fire hoses on us. If we do that, we can change the world. And Bayard Rustin was also the one who started the Million Man March. Like he didn't start it, but he's the one who organized it. He got everything up. And there's a picture of Bayard Rustin. He's got gray hair and a mustache. So when you see Martin Luther King Jr. talking at the Million Man March, he's standing there. I think it's to his right. So I love Bayard Rustin. He's kind of my big deal. He kind of got pushed out of the movement for a long time because he happened to be homosexual. But now, obviously, the movement's been pushing him back because he did so much for it. So let's talk about Nelson Mandela. Obviously, the established power structure, because we're talking about world history, the established power structure was apartheid, which was racial segregation. So here's why I like to talk about him. Born in 1918, the government in the 1940s South Africa, because of Great Britain, we took over and then we left and we said, good luck, guys. And the power structure there was an all-white government, and they established what is known as apartheid, separate living for Black people and white people. If you are fans of Trevor Noah, you know that he had a white father and a Black mother. And there were times that the way he saw his father was his mother would take him for a walk down the street, and his father would walk down one side of the street, and he would walk across the street with his mother because he was illegal. He couldn't go and run and hold hands with his father because that would be illegal. He was a product of apartheid. And, he's pretty young. So he was born in the 90s. He's about my age, probably, a little bit younger than me, but still. So Nelson Mandela, born in 1918, and he had to live during apartheid. So he's arrested several times. He decides he's going to fight against apartheid. He's arrested because he's going up against it. He's put on trial again and again. He's influenced by Marxism. He joins the banned South African Communism Party. And they were trying to overthrow the government. And I know overthrowing the government's not always a good thing, but I would say if we look back on this would be one of those times it's okay to overthrow your government. I'm just going to say. He's then imprisoned in 1962 and sentenced to life in prison. He wasn't released until 1990 when there were fears of a racial civil war. So they were like, let's just release this guy so maybe no one will kill us. That was what the white people were saying. And other countries actually started to threaten to stop trading with South Africa, or they were like raising taxes on what they were going to sell or buy from them. Although you should probably look up, I think the policies between the US and South Africa and those with the UK and South Africa were very questionable. Yeah. So, but he does become president in 1994. Essentially, they get rid of apartheid. It's amazing. So they do pretty well for themselves. And he is essentially, that's global resistance against an established power structure. So if you're like, wow, what if I have an SAQ on this? Should probably do the readings and be prepared for that. All right. No, it's not the only place. Let's talk about where this whole Soviet Union thing is going to start to chip away. Ooh, okay. So there's challenges to Soviet power. Now, they're not successful, but the challenges exist. So in the Soviet bloc, that's where all those countries are that the Soviet Union's trying to hold on to. In Poland, for example, many places were told, all these countries, collectivization is for the common good. So essentially, like, you don't own your part of your land that you farm on. The country owns it. You farm it. You get to keep some of the stuff, but it's collectivization for the common good. But in Poland, it never really takes off because people are going, but this is my land. I've owned this land. My father owned this land. My grandfather owned this land. No, you don't get to take it away. You have to understand that Polish farmers fiercely resisted collectivization. In some cases, they cut down forests that were marked for nationalization. In some places in the Eastern Bloc, people would kill their animals, like their farming animals, just because they refused to have the government own them. That's how crazy it was. According to some sources, peasants feared collectivization more than a hypothetical future World War III, hoping that such a war would help them keep their land. Okay, so it got so bad that the Soviet Union finally said, "Fine, you can keep your farms. Like we're done fighting it." I mean, they still got to keep Poland, but Now, Hungary. Ooh, okay. So Hungary's gonna. All right. There's this thing called the Warsaw Pact. Let's go over it. It's known as the Warsaw Pact. It's also known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. It's the East's version of NATO. And I don't mean East as in China, Japan. I mean Soviet Union. They call it the Warsaw Pact. America had the NATO. They had this Warsaw Pact, which they hiddenly called the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. So Hungary wanted out. Starting in October of 1856, protesters are starting to demand a more democratic political system and freedom from the Soviets. So the Soviets put this guy named Imre Nagy, Imrenagy, into power. And he's like, hey, look, just remove the troops and the Hungarians will be happy. So the Soviets removed their troops from Hungary. But then Nagy pushes the revolt some more by getting rid of the one party rule in Hungary. And he's like, okay, we're leaving the Warsaw Pact. So on November 4th, 1956, Soviet tanks roll into Budapest, and in one day, it's all over. 2 days later, Nagy is executed. So that was pretty bad. Now let's go to Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring was this brief period in 1968 when the leader of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, D-U-B-C-E-K, he was the secretary of the Czechoslovakia Communist Party. He grants the press freedom of expression. He started sweeping reforms, which included a revised constitution that guaranteed civil rights and liberties, basically helping the country. He wanted to offer socialism instead of communism. The people start to call for more democracy, but the Soviet Union is like, this is counter-revolution. So on August 20th, 1968, the Soviet armed forces invade and occupy, and by the following April, Dubček is deposed. So these are pictures of the Hungarian uprising. All right, so let's talk about the military-industrial complex, just briefly. This was a term that came up with Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who, by the way, used to be General Eisenhower. This idea of the expansion of the defense industry. Private industries are essentially supplying the demands of the military, and it makes it harder and harder to curtail military spending. So this is a great picture. You have Congress, who are funding through taxes the Department of Defense, who are then giving tax-funded contracts to large military corporations, who are then, through lobbyists, giving campaign contributions to members of Congress. Now, why is the military-industrial complex growing? Because over time, we start having these groups that we have to essentially help defeat. So you can see the pluses and negatives. Why having a large military-industrial complex can be bad, because more funding to the military means less funding to other parts of the government. But at the same time, you have organizations such as the Shining Path, which is a communist party of Peru. The US has helped fight it, but this is also something that we should just touch on just so you're aware. The Shining Path is a group. Their goal is to overthrow the state by guerrilla warfare and replace it with a new democracy, then inducing a cultural revolution and eventually sparking a world revolution, which would eventually rival full communism. This was started in 1969 by a former university professor, Abimael Guzman, who loved the writings of Mao Zedong. They started slow by burning ballot boxes in 1980, but then throughout the 1980s, they held public trials, including public executions. Small towns loved the justice they were serving, especially when the victims were disliked. In the 90s, though, the government started to crack down. Guzman was captured in 92. The leadership fell. There have been some resurgences, but it hasn't really been as successful as before. Lately, they've been trying to rebrand themselves as not as violent, but they kept being taken down by the government for wanting to do violent things. This is just one of the many communist groups that the United States has been trying to fight during the Cold War. So that is something that you would think, okay, well, when the Cold War is over, the military-industrial complex will be done. We don't need it. Except we have something that was kind of happening during the Cold War, as a result of the Cold War, and is something we're still fighting today. Al Qaeda, or Al Qaeda, depending how you pronounce it. Al Qaeda is the militant Sunni Islamist multinational organization founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam, and several others during the Soviet Afghan War. So that was late 70s, around the 80s. The goal was to create a strong Islamic state. It has been designated as a terrorist group by the United Nations Security Council, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's NATO, the European Union, the US, China, the UK, Russia, India, and several other countries. They are responsible for the 1998 US embassy bombings, the 9/11 attacks, and the 2002 Bali bombings. They believe that a Christian Jewish alliance is a conspiracy to destroy Islam. They oppose all man made laws. They wish to impose Sharia law. And here's the deal, this is kind of where it gets a little murky, how they came to be. So the US was involved in getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan. There's a great movie. It's got a lot of curse words, though, and drug use and some nudity. So you're going to have to get your parents' permission to watch. It's called Charlie Wilson's War. Tom Hanks, Julia Roberts. Good movie, but again, get your parents' permission or you'll have to be 18. Basically, the Soviets were trying to get in Afghanistan, get inside of that area because of the oil and so on and so forth. And the US didn't want them to be there. So we go in and we help fund the Afghanis, to help them stop the Soviets from taking over. Well, when the war was over, we left. And we left them completely destroyed. We didn't help clean up. We didn't help build schools. We didn't help them do anything. We just walked away. Okay, I'd be a little annoyed, but whatever. What we did, though, is we trained many people who would later become members of Al Qaeda. We also funded a lot of members who would join Al Qaeda. We also helped train and fund bin Laden. Then we were there for the Gulf War. The Saudi monarch refused bin Laden's help. Bin Laden said, let us give you troops, let us give you money, let us give you guns. And the Saudi monarch said, no. I'm going to use the US help. I'm going to let the US bring in their troops. Bin Laden saw foreign troops coming in and destroying sacred soil. And he said that basically the foreign troops on the land of the two mosques was what was destroying the sacred soil. And that was what ticked him off. That was when he was like, now you're in my neighborhood and I'm done with you. So we essentially trained him, funded him, and made him very mad. Now, was he right to do what he did? No, but we funded him. So it's a murky situation. Now, the military-industrial complex, should it be as big as it is? Depends if you like the military or not. That's up to you. So my thing about it, though, is I always find it funny is that General Eisenhower, then President Eisenhower, was the one who said, guys, we should probably not have as big a military as we do. That's always the funniest thing. Now, the end of the Cold War. What? Yes, it's going to end. So we essentially start to relax tensions in the 70s. And it says here, of course, it was symbolized by the SALT Treaty signed by Nixon and Brezhnev. That was known as the Detente. Gorbachev, that's the guy on the left up top, signing something with former President George H.W. Bush. He favors progressive reforms, perestroika, which was known as restructuring economic reforms, and glasnost, which means openness, allowing greater free expression, criticism of Soviet policies. Here's the deal. Here's why we were never going to bomb each other. There's a term called MAD, mutually assured destruction. They were never going to bomb us, and we were never going to bomb them. Because the moment one of our systems said, you have a nuclear weapon coming towards you in the US, we would have shot off 20 more towards them. So it was mutually assured that we would have destroyed each other. So the Soviet Union was never going to destroy us, and we were never going to destroy them. It just wasn't going to happen because we didn't want to die and they didn't want to die. So in the end, it was going to work out just fine. But why did it all fall? Why couldn't the Soviet Union make communism work? We've talked about it in class. It is a great idea on paper, right? Everyone has secured funding, everyone has a job, everyone has money and food and protection. It sounds amazing. But it doesn't work. I know, because capitalism has its flaws as well. However, capitalism does allow for this company to create a rocket, but then this company creates a better rocket. And that's why we got to the moon. So we had advances in US military technology. Well, they did not. They failed in their invasion of Afghanistan because we were funding the Afghanis to basically fight them off. And we already talked about the fact that you had Poland and you had Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Already their Eastern Bloc was fighting them, and they were tired of the fact that they couldn't have any democracy. And also, that Berlin Wall? People on the East were still getting videotapes about TV shows in America. So they were watching these shows with David Hasselhoff. I know you may not know who he is, but just look him up. He was on this show called Knight Rider, and it was a thing. They loved Knight Rider. They loved the shows called like Dallas, and they saw Western opulence. They saw jeans. They saw our jewelry, and they went, you know what? I want that. Why can't I have the choice to have that? And it sounds crazy, but they just wanted choice. And also, they had economic weakness because they were limited in who they could trade with. And that led to stagnant growth. So that's why they fell. Again, it looks great on paper, it doesn't work in practice. And we've talked about that hundreds of times. So, Unit 8 wrap up. This is what you need to know about Unit 8. People and states are going to challenge the political and social order, leading to unprecedented worldwide conflicts. Huh. And the Cold War extends beyond its original ideological origins to profoundly shape that 20th century politics. And you need to know, of course, new global institutions will emerge: the United Nations, the WTO, and the European Union. So, hope you had fun. I did. Have a great day. Bye.